I'm Yehuda Blum. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the transformation of the United Nations, founded on the ruins of World War II and on the ashes of the Shoah, into an organization that has been routinely spreading anti-Semitism, often masquerading as anti-Zionism, must surely rank as one of the great travesties of the second half of the 20th century. Under the shock of the magnitude of the murder of two-thirds of European Jewry, the General Assembly adopted in 1948 the Genocide Convention, and the Fourth Geneva Red Cross Convention of 1949 was also heavily influenced by this traumatic experience. And even the adoption of the Partition Recommendation of November 1947 that has led to the establishment of Israel was largely considered at the time as an act of contrition and belated justice on the part of the organized international community. It is, of course, a sad reflection on that community that millions of Jews, including 1.5 million children, had first to die for it to recognize the right of self-determination of one of the most ancient peoples on earth. But the memories and lessons of the Shoah faded fast. In late 1959, synagogues and Jewish cemeteries in Germany were desecrated. The epidemic of swastika daubing of Jewish institutions in cemeteries spread fast, from Buenos Aires to Melbourne, from Stockholm to Cape Town. The State of Israel alerted scores of states to the dangers of the revival of anti-Semitism, and also requested that this item be inscribed on the agenda of the UN General Assembly. However, anti-Semitism was quickly subsumed under a broader heading covering all manifestations of racism, thus deliberately downplaying the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, this unique and historically most persistent form of racial and religious persecution. In the discussions in the Third Committee of the General Assembly, speakers were still careful not to attack Jews and their religion per se. Instead, the Arabs and their supporters in the Soviet camp usually attacked Israel and its policies. Still, the atmosphere in the Third Committee already reflected the fundamental changes both in the composition and the central objectives of the UN, while it had been dominated in its first 15 years by Western Europe, the United States, Latin America, and the British Commonwealth, mostly democratic states. By the early 60s, it had more than doubled its original membership. The new members came almost exclusively from Asia and Africa, including a vast influx of new Arab states. The new majority, supported by the Soviet Union, mostly dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, was preoccupied with the apartheid situation in South Africa. There quickly emerged an unspoken quid pro quo between the two major components of the so-called non-aligned states, namely the African and Arab states. Support by the Arabs in the anti-apartheid struggle of the Africans, in exchange for African support for the adoption of increasingly vitriolic anti-Israel resolutions. The apartheid label attached to Israel has even outlived that regime, to the point where a former president of the United States saw fit recently to include it in the title of a book devoted to the Arab-Israel conflict. Incidentally, it was then that the Arabs also first raised the grotesque argument that since they were themselves Semites, they couldn't be anti-Semites. But the cover was soon blown. The tenets of the PLO covenant, which contrary to popular belief has still not been revoked, have become the staple of the anti-Israel Arab propaganda. One salient aspect of those tenets is contained in Article 20 of that covenant, which states that claims of historical and religious ties of Jews with Palestine are incompatible with the facts of history. As will be recalled, even as late as Camp David II in 2000, Arafat denied the existence of the Temple of Solomon and his followers do their very best these days in their excavations on Temple Mount to remove there every trace of the Jewish past. In the wake of the Six-Day War and the resulting revival of Jewish national consciousness in the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities intensified their intimidation of the Jewish community. This included branding Israel and the Zionist movement as racist bodies and the denigration of the Jewish religion as the fountainhead of such racist outlook. The Arabs and their supporters at the UN were only too happy to join the Soviet-led campaign demonizing Israel, Zionism, and Judaism. The linkage between Israel and racist South Africa was now firmly entrenched in the annual General Assembly resolutions. Thus, for example, in December 1973, the General Assembly, in a resolution dealing with the situation in South Africa, emphasized, and I quote, the collusion between Portuguese colonialism, the apartheid regime of South Africa, and Zionism. The General Assembly also singled out Israel for condemnation for its trade with South Africa, which constituted 0.4%, less than 0.5% of South Africa's foreign trade, at a time when countries like France and the Soviet Union traded with South Africa on a much larger scale, not to speak of many of the black African countries that voted for Israel's condemnation, and Arab countries regularly trading their oil for South African gold. The stage was now set for the infamous Resolution 3379 of 1975 that determined that Zionism was a form of racism and racial discrimination. This defamation of Zionism, the driving political force that had led to the establishment of Israel, was clearly intended to delegitimize the Jewish state. And sure enough, now all dams broke at the UN. The pretense of distinguishing between Jews and Judaism on the one hand and Zionism on the other hand, allegedly respecting the former while condemning the latter, was now cast to the winds. Listening to some of the statements in the General Assembly and its committees, as well as in other organs of the UN, one was reminded of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and of the vulgar anti-Semitic literature between the two world wars. Let me give you some representative samples of the style that has now become acceptable at the UN. In December 1980, the permanent representative of Jordan told the General Assembly that there was, I quote, a Jewish cabal which controls, manipulates, and exploits the rest of humanity by controlling the money and wealth of the world. In the same diatribe, he also stated that, and I quote again, people like Lord Rothschild, every day in ironclad secrecy, decide and flash around the world how high the price of gold should be on each particular day. The United States has a national income of upwards of $2,000 billion per annum, and while millions of hardworking and God-fearing Americans are unemployed, the Zionists own a lion's share of that great abundance. In December 1983, the representative of Libya had this to say in the UN General Assembly: the time has come for the UN to strive to save the peoples of the world from this racist entity. It is high time to realize that the Jewish Zionists here in the United States attempt to destroy Americans. Look around New York. Who are the owners of pornographic film operations and houses? Is it not the Jews who are exploiting the American people and trying to debase them? We hope that the day will soon come when we can eradicate this affront, this aberration of history, which we committed when we accepted within our organization this band of criminals, mercenaries, and terrorists, the most vile people on earth. This vulgar anti-Semitic outburst is not devoid of a special irony, for it was Israel's decisive vote that terminated the British trusteeship over Libya, thus leading to its independence and admission to the United Nations. Nor was post-1979 Iran lagging behind its anti-Semitic colleagues. In November 1983, its representative expressed the hope, with reference to Israel, that, quote, the Muslim countries will soon consider the final solution. Iranian Foreign Minister